Matthew 26, verses 1 through 5. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and to kill him. But not during the feast, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. Every Sunday when we recite the words for the communion service, there is a phrase that we repeat. It says, and now we talk about the mystery of faith. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. This Sunday and for the next 2 Sundays, I'm going to dig into those 3 phrases a little bit. Today I'm going to focus on the reality that Christ has died. And with each one, if you would kind of keep in the back of your mind the question, so what? What difference does it make? Matthew 26, 1. Jesus repeated what he'd said to the other disciples. In 2 days, the Passover began. The Passover will begin 2 days, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Jesus knew he was going to die. He also knew the means of his death, that he would be crucified. The Romans weren't the ones who invented crucifixion, but they raised it to a high level of public spectacle. Crucifixion was, even by the Romans, considered so cruel that it was that Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixion. If you were a Roman citizen, you would not be crucified no matter what you did, except in the case of high treason. Then you would be crucified. Crucifixion was a painful, humiliating, degrading, terrible experience. Not only was it very painful, but it would have been extremely painful for families and friends to watch somebody that they cared for to suffer that and not be able to do anything to offer any comfort or to stop what was going to happen. Crucifixion was, I don't know how common, but common enough that I am very certain that not only Jesus, but all of the disciples had an idea of what crucifixion was going to be like. Jesus knew what was waiting him in Jerusalem, and he chose to go anyway. The chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, and they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way to kill him. The reality of our faith is that one of the central things that makes us Christian is the truth that Jesus died. Christ has died. Now looking at those 3 phrases, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, you'll notice that the tense changes. Christ has died, that's past tense. Next week we're going to be talking about Christ not did rise, Christ is risen, present tense. And then in 2 weeks we'll talk about Christ will come again, future tense. In Mark chapter 14, verse 25, it tells us that the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, the whole high religious council, were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. They were planning it. They'd been plotting it for many months, perhaps a year or more. They had been trying to figure out some way that they could get rid of this person they considered a troublemaker. And so they were plotting. But it wasn't against God's plan. Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now we come back to the so what question. Why did Jesus die? He was the Son of God. He could, the Bible tells us, have called down legions of angels, thousands of angels, to set him free from the Romans. He performed many miracles. He healed the dead. He raised the dead. He healed the sick, brought sight to the blind, walked on water, did all of these miracles. Why couldn't he have miraculously just come down from the cross? Wouldn't have that been just a mind-blowing thing? Here all of the people that had seen him arrested, seen the torture, and seen him nailed to the cross, if he would have just said, okay, enough of this and come down, wouldn't have that been just an incredible miracle? But no. God demonstrated his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We're going to circle back to the question of why. Why? Isaiah 53 begins to lay some groundwork, and this was a few hundred years, several hundred years before Jesus was even born. But this prophecy about him, he was pierced for our transgressions. Our transgressions. Pilate himself said, this man is innocent. This man is innocent. He doesn't deserve death. But the crowds were shouting, crucify him, because the priests and the religious leaders had stirred them up into this frenzy. And so Pilate said, all right, I don't want to riot. Just go ahead, do what you want. But Pilate himself had declared that he was innocent. So Jesus was pierced not for his own transgressions, but for ours. He was crushed for our iniquities. I've read a number of descriptions of what crucifixion entailed. Two of them by medical pathologists, coroners, saying that based on what the Bible tells us about the torture, the beatings, what was used in the torture, what archaeology has unearthed about the flogs that were used, the whips that were used to flog prisoners, all of those things, in medical terms, describing just what it was to go through crucifixion. But Jesus' crucifixion was different. It wasn't just a matter of being nailed to the cross until he died. He was whipped and tortured and beaten and ridiculed for a significant amount of time before he even started to carry that heavy cross piece for the cross all of the way to Golgotha. There is no written account of anyone else in all of history that was tortured before crucifixion the way Jesus was. And 2 days before he was arrested, he told his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem. There I will be handed over to the chief priests and the leaders and the teachers of the law, and I will be crucified. Jesus knew what was coming. It says, he was crushed for our iniquities. Knowing that that was coming, knowing that he was innocent, he went because of our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds, we're healed. The first phrase, Christ has died. These aren't simple words. This isn't a simple act. The next question, and there are people that still are spinning the myth that Jesus did not really die. He fainted and was taken down, and after he fainted, the disciples revived him, and he walked off into the sunset. John 19:31. Now it was the day of the preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Now the reason for that, when a person is crucified, their hands were nailed or at least tied to the cross, and their feet were either nailed or tied to the cross down below the post. Over an extended period of time, exhaustion would set in and the person's body would slump down. And medically what happens is that opens up your lungs so that you're kind of in an inhale, like take a deep breath. But because you're hanging by your arms, you can't exhale. So you'd have to push up with your feet to take some weight off of your arms so you could exhale. Usually, a person was left hanging on the cross to suffer for as long as it takes, because that's part of the spectacle. That's part of the punishment that people desperately wanted to avoid. And so one of the things that they would do is they would come and they would break the person's legs so they could no longer push up, and then they would be asphyxiated. They would suffocate because they could no longer breathe. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that what he tells, that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. These things happen so that the scripture would be filled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced. The reason why Jesus died first instead of the other two was because they hadn't been beaten. He already had significant blood loss. He was quite probably in shock. And so from his wounds, he died earlier. But they saw that Jesus was already dead. The soldiers were professional executioners. This was their job. They were good at it. They would have known whether he was dead or alive. But just to be sure, they took a spear, jabbed it up through his ribs into his heart. They knew he was dead. John 19, verse 38. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus in the night. Nicodemus had brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was according to the Jewish burial customs. If Jesus had not been dead, truly dead, they would have known it. That took a significant amount of time to prepare his body for burial. They knew what they were doing. A book that I've spoken to you about is by Lee Strobel. It's called The Case for Christ. In it, he interviews a number of people in searching for as much evidence that he can that Jesus truly was the Christ, the Messiah. And one of the interviews was with Dr. Alexander Metherell. He's a medical doctor, a research scientist, and a pathologist. And he talks about the Roman soldiers being experts in killing. That was their job. They did it very well. And they would have known without any doubt that when a person was dead. One of the reasons that they would have known without any doubt is because if they had a prisoner that they were supposed to execute that lived, they themselves, the soldiers that had been responsible for killing him, would have been killed. It was their neck on the lines if they didn't assure that Jesus was dead. Now, this is part of the interview with this Dr. Alexander. He said, Jesus intentionally walked into the arms of his betrayer, Judas. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't defend himself at his trial. It was clear that he was willingly subjecting himself to what you've described as a humiliating, agonizing form of torture. No, this is Lee Strobel that's asking this. And he said, and I'd like to know why. What possibly could have motivated a person to endure this sort of punishment? Dr. Methrow searched for the right words. And he said, frankly, I don't know. I don't think a typical person could have done it. But Jesus knew what was coming and was willing to go through it because this was the only way he could redeem us, by serving as our substitute and paying the death penalty that we deserve because of our rebellion against God. That was his whole mission in coming to earth. The question, why? Why did he die? To redeem you. To pay the death penalty that you owe and that I owe in our place. Having sensed that, Lee Strobel said, I could still sense Methrow's relentlessly rational and logical and organized mind was continuing to crunch down my question of why to its most basic, irreducible answer. Then Dr. Merrill said, so when you ask what motivating him, well, I suppose the answer can be summed up in one word, and that would be love. Christ has died because he loved you. 2,000 years ago, he already knew you. He already knew what mistakes I was going to make in my life. He already knew what times I was going to fail him, to be unfaithful to him. He already knew all of that. But he loved you. And so Christ has died. Psalm 111, verse 7. The works of his hands are faithful and just. All his precepts are trustworthy. They are steadfast forever and ever, done in faithfulness and uprightness. He provided redemption for his people. He ordained his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name. Now this is in the book of Psalms, again written several hundred years before Jesus was born. The prophecy, Jesus and God through Jesus provided redemption for his people, you and me. Romans 5:9. Paul wrote, since we now have been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, when we were in God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Christ has died. We know the story doesn't end there. I'll see you next week.